Good afternoon. I hope that you're doing well, and I am happy to have you here with me today. My name is Carmen Wimberly Coffin, and I am in Raleigh, North Carolina, where it is rainy, as it has been for the last day. And I want to share a little bit with you about a question that I have been repeatedly asked over the last several years. Um, First of all, um, I have grown up in the space of race and racial equity and injustice my entire life. Um, Not only am I black, but I was raised by a couple who believed that racial equality was important, and they taught me about it not just verbally, but in how they lived their life. So I was asked a question. This is not the first time I've been asked this question or this has been referred to by a white classmate, schoolmate from middle school through high school. Her name is Cindy Burbage McNeil, and this was the series of questions that she asked me last week. So they're going to be a series of talks about, um, because I can't answer all of this in one time. Before I start, I want to tell you, um, for those of you who know me, you've been seeing a blue wall behind me for the last couple of weeks. Um, but family is important to me, and so this is what you see behind me is a collage of family pictures that I put together last year or year before last for a family reunion. Um, my family and my family history is extremely important to me. The legacy that they left and the legacy that I hope to leave for my children is one of knowing who and where we came from and being proud of it. And if that's something that you aren't doing with your family, it's important for you to teach your children, regardless of their age, who they are, where they came from, because they need to be proud of their people. Okay, I digressed. Here's the question that I was asked. It was a long question, and as I said, it's going to be a long answer. And when I read it, I'm going to start with the very last line to explain first. The question was, I want to understand why so many blacks, certainly not all, choose to hold on to the pain of decades and centuries past. I have seen upward movement and equal opportunity for the black community throughout my lifetime, 60 plus years. I do see evil in the country world. Evil acts are about a person's heart and mental state, not about their skin color. You simply cannot blanket every death as racial. Do Black Lives Matter when blacks are killed by other blacks? Or does the phrase only apply when killed by a white person to keep the narrative of racism on the forefront? How about when a black person kills a white person, like Eve Carson in 2008, who was kidnapped at gunpoint, robbed, and hours later shot to death by two black men in Chapel Hill? Was her death about racism? Did Eve's life matter? Whites are killed in large numbers by the police, too. The difference, no movement, riots, violence, looting, and arson occur, or additional killings. Whites killed by police barely make headlines. Police brutality is a separate issue and needs to be dealt with. So does the daily killing of blacks by blacks. By was kind of shouted out. I doubt Eve Carson's death is the only death at the hands of a black individual in 10 years. I am not here to respond to questions and or debate race, racism, and race relations with an unknown 60-year-old white liberal female from Washington state. I am responding to Carmen, whom I have known since 1970 in Raleigh, North Carolina, and who I believe may have grown up more privileged than myself. Okay, let's take a deep dive. So I'm going to the last two paragraphs. She posted this on my Facebook page, and a white female, I guess from Washington State, uh, tried to give her some guidance as to what white privilege was and how she could become an ally in the fight against racism. Um, I don't believe, from what Cindy says, that racism only applies to people who are in the position of being an oppressor. And so that's why the statement was made that she wasn't there to debate any of that with this unknown white liberal female, um, and that she was responding to me. Um, and that she believes I've grown up more privileged than she has. So I don't know all of her story. I know she was a schoolmate. I know she is white. Um, I know that we got along between sixth grade and graduation of high school. Um, we are not best friends. We are not friends. We are schoolmates. Um, but she is a Facebook friend, and I have many of those from my middle school and high school years, many of whom espouse the same positions that Cindy does. So first of all, let me define privilege. And I went through the Cambridge English Dictionary to get my definitions. Privilege is a noun. The first definition is that it's an advantage that only one person or group of people has, usually because of their position or because they are rich. Privilege is, the second definition is an opportunity to do something special or enjoyable. So the way in which rich people or people from a high social class have most of the advantages in society. And another definition is a special advantage or authority possessed by a particular person or group. So let me start with a little bit of my family history. Perhaps, and I've written this because there's a lot, perhaps on my mother's side, California Grady Wimberly, for those of you who don't know, there was a class standing of some generations in eastern North Carolina, but they were still black. I will not deny my heritage, and I will not claim that we were poverty-stricken farmers. However, my grandparents had 8 children to raise before and during the Depression. They were fortunate enough to own their land back several generations. My mother's maternal and paternal heritage was not only farmers and landowners, but they were active in the community, politically as well as tradespeople. They were staunch believers in education for their children, whether vocational or higher education. They were, and we still are, proud of our heritage and thankful that the Wynn and Grady names are forever attached to the town of Mount Olive, North Carolina, that was built on land that the family sold to create the town. Granted, the railroad was coming through and they were sued to sell the property, but they did sell it, and so they are attached. Mount Olive was created because the Grady family, the Wynn Grady family, sold land to create that town. On my father's side, my maternal grandmother's family can be traced back several generations, but stops back at the 7th generation because that grandmother could only remember being sold as a slave at the age of 12 in the state of Virginia to a white man at a pond and being brought to Pitt County, North Carolina. The family lineage from there forward is intact. My paternal grandparents' family came to North Carolina from Wimberley, Texas, and I'm still learning about that lineage, but I do know that they were slaves. They had been released, I assume, in Texas due to Juneteenth, and they walked to North Carolina. People dropped off along the way. Both sides of the family knew that they were the way out of poverty was through education, and they did what it took to achieve that. My grandparents' families on my father's side included ministers, electricians, librarians, and pharmacists, social workers, um, teachers. So to say that I was privileged, I would have to agree with that. And that's taken me some delving and rethinking who I was. My families on both sides were fortunate enough to be able to create some amount of financial gain throughout their lives. But mind you, they never forgot they were black because they were never allowed to forget that they were black. And they had to deal with everything that that entailed. So, for privilege that I grew up with uh, financially, and it takes financial privilege, it takes the ability to have money to do some of the things that I grew up doing. That's kind of required. My parents did not marry until the age of 30. They had both worked during their school years and after graduation. My mother became a teacher after she graduated from Hampton University in Virginia and was hired out of college to teach at an elementary school in Mount Olive, North Carolina, Carver Elementary. And then she was hired away from that school because it was heard that she was a great teacher. And Mr. Eaton, who was the principal at Washington Elementary School in Raleigh, came to Mount Olive, observed her teach, and then hired her away to the Raleigh public school system to Washington School. She taught there, with the exception of 1 year that she taught in Japan at the American Dependent Schools on the base, until she was moved to desegregate Mary P. Douglas Elementary School in Raleigh. When the schools were desegregated in Raleigh by teachers, and that was done first, uh, it doesn't mean that there weren't some black children allowed to attend some white schools, but it was not a full desegregation. I was one of those children. I attended Longview Gardens Elementary School for second through part of fourth grade. Um, but Raleigh Public School System administration asked the black principals at schools to choose their best teachers, and those were the teachers that desegregated the Raleigh Public School System first. My mother later taught at Meredith College and then worked for the state of North Carolina until she retired. She was excellent at everything she did. I want to say that because that's the spirit that she taught me to be. My father grew up in Raleigh after living in Henderson for his first 5 years. He graduated from Virginia Union and entered the Temple School of Pharmacy in Philadelphia. When he finished school there with his pharmacy degree, he entered North Carolina Central School for Chemistry and received his master's from there. He applied for jobs as a pharmacist in several places and was rejected generally because of his race, not because of the excellence of his work or the lack of excellence. He had worked with his father in his drugstore, which was also in Raleigh. My grandfather, I've mentioned previously in other videos, that my grandfather was a graduate of the Shaw Leonard School of Medicine and Pharmacy before it shut down. And he had a drugstore in Raleigh at the corner of Swain and Cabarrus Street. It was called Central Drugstore. He worked there until his death in 1977. My father worked there, and then he also worked for Dr. York Garrett in Durham. And Dr. Garrett was a friend of my grandfather's. They were classmates at Leonard and had known each other from growing up in Tarboro. And so he sold my father Garrett Parker Drugstore in Durham, and my father owned that until the time of urban renewal in Durham, which swept the country during the early 60s. Urban renewal was a time when the government would come in and purchase property, generally in the black part of town, to create a highway system. and the interstate highway system, if you will read its history, um, was built on the backs of the black community. So in downtown Durham, where Highway 147 goes through, you will notice it goes through the black side of town. It does not go through the white side of town until it gets close to Duke University. Um, my father returned to Raleigh and bought another drugstore, community drugstore, which he ran from 1964 until he retired in 2003. That drugstore, community drugstore, was at the corner of Blunt and Lenore Streets in downtown Raleigh. And he retired from there in 2003. Okay. Because my parents married later in life at the age of 30, they were able to save money for a down payment on houses in both Durham and in Raleigh. I will say, before they purchased each home, before they purchased a home, we lived in rental property. When they looked for a house in Raleigh, after they had been renting a house, and I don't believe they intended to rent long. They wanted to build a house. But my mother wanted a nice house, and she could have had one in the nicer communities in southeast Raleigh, but the communities were full. So as she looked around, as they looked, she was not able to find property um, that they really liked. So as a teacher, she would see ads and signs in yards for a real estate company called the Teacher's Home, I believe, the Teacher's something. And so she looked at those homes, and my parents looked for a house for 4 years in Raleigh and could not find something that they liked, could not find the size land that they were willing to purchase inside the city limits in southeast Raleigh. Excuse me. So they did start to look in white neighborhoods. Black people were beginning to be allowed to purchase homes in white neighborhoods, but it wasn't often, and it wasn't without some difficulty. So for 4 years, I would be taking piano lessons on Saturday mornings. They would drop me off, and they would go and look at houses, and they would decide what they wanted to look at other than driving by, and my mother would call and make appointments during the week. When she would make the appointments and they would show up for the showing, they were often told that the house was sold. And it became so prevalent that she began to go back in those neighborhoods later in the week or perhaps the next week, and the for sale signs would still be up and the houses would not be sold. At that point, she realized that it was discrimination. So the house that they finally bought and lived in for 40 years was off of Ridge Road. When she called and made the appointment, was making the appointment to look at the house, the owner, the builder, told him that she was black, and he told her that he didn't care what color she was as long as her money was green. That's the way life should be. So they bought that house, and I will tell you that the rumor that went through the neighborhood was that there was a black family moving in with 8 kids, and the property values were going straight down. So the day we moved into the house, my mother had a station wagon. She had my brother and myself, and she picked up all 6 of my cousins who lived in Raleigh and pulled up in the driveway. So my mother taught me how to fight, but she taught me that I didn't have to be loud to do it. I just had to make my point. During the time, my mother was also involved in an organization in Raleigh called the Panel of American Women. It was started in 1968. It was a young organization. It was started by a Jewish woman named Esther Brown in Missouri because of racial prejudice in her city. The organization consisted of women, black and white, WASP. WASP is White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, for those who don't know. It was what we used to call white people back in in the day, as my kids say, um, Jewish and Catholic women. All the black, the Jewish, and the Catholic women definitely experienced discrimination. Um, they would go wherever they were invited and speak on the ills of racism and prejudice. There was always a panel discussion, and after the panel discussion, they were open to audience questions. The group would be moderated by the WASP, or by the white woman, and the, the other three women would talk about their story. They would talk about racial and prejudicial actions that had been taken against them and their families. Many of you may not know that during the 60s, there was much prejudice against people who were Catholic. It was kind of amazing, uh, if you studied the time, the fact that during the Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy race, Kennedy was attacked for being Catholic. They were not expecting him necessarily to win, because he was Catholic, and there was such prejudice against Catholicism. And at any rate, the women would tell their story about the prejudices that they had faced and how they dealt with it. And the moderator would then take questions from the audience and direct the conversation afterwards. They were not always welcome where they spoke, but they went wherever they were invited because they knew that racial prejudice and discrimination was not a good thing. And so um, the children of the mothers played together. We went to camp together in the summer. I drove past St. Giles Presbyterian Church last week because that was one of the first integrated camps that I went to. Um, and many of us still kind of keep up with each other in some bits. Um, Getting back to where my parents were looking for homes, several times they made offers to purchase and were turned down because of race. One time they had a signed purchase offer and had gotten to the attorney's office to close, and the seller dropped out because his family, he worked for IBM, and he was moving, I think, to Pennsylvania, and would have to leave his family behind, his wife and his children, to close up the house and then move with him. His family was threatened because he was selling his home they were selling their home to a black family. And so at the attorney's office, he pulled out. I believe my mother said he was tearful, but he was fearful for his family, and of course they understood that. That house was off of Blue Ridge Road. Uh, and as I told you, they finally did buy a house off of Ridge Road, and they lived in that house from 3 weeks after Martin Luther King was assassinated for the next 40 years. While many people would say that I'm privileged because of the neighborhood that I grew up in, they don't know my whole story. They've never asked my whole story. They just knew that I grew up in a white neighborhood. It put me in kind of an awkward place growing up. First of all, I was the only girl in my neighborhood. Well, that's not true. There was one younger girl in the neighborhood, but she was not allowed to talk to the black people. And I became a tomboy because there were only boys to play with. So we would play ball out in the street. We would play kickball. They would play basketball. And I would be out there, and sometimes I would play and sometimes I wouldn't. But what was sad to me was this young white girl who didn't have brothers or sisters. She had no siblings. The only black people she was allowed to talk to were her maid, the maid at their house. And she would sit out on this curb and watch us play, because as long as my brother and I were participating in the play, she could not do so. There were other girls in the neighborhood, but they were all much older than me, and it was difficult for me to play with black children because they lived on the other side of town. And of course, if you have children, you know they can't drive, so you're at the mercy of what your parents are allowed to do. And so the only place I really saw a lot of black kids was at church on Sundays. And I thought that they didn't like me because I never got invited to their birthday parties. I never got invited to their, their get-togethers. Not realizing until I was an adult that that was part of the reason, was because we couldn't drive, we couldn't go places unless our parents took us, and also most of my friends have large families, so they didn't really invite other people to come in and participate with things with them because that could be a hardship. Uh, so I felt like as I was growing up that I was all by myself. My mother and father involved me in organizations, but it's still hard to really develop close relationships if you only see somebody somewhere once a month during the school year, and then you don't see them, you know, during the summer unless you're at the pool. And yes, my family belonged to a country club. Wasn't Carolina Country Club because black people weren't allowed to join there. It wasn't Raleigh Country Club because black people weren't allowed to join there. We belonged to Meadowbrook Country Club, which was situated in Garner, and it was the first country club for African Americans in the country. And it was a private ownership only country club, and it has now closed down. The golf course is still there, but still, we were only there occasionally. So people don't understand that my parents put social justice in the forefront of our family. We lived a life of service to the community. It took me a long time to understand that. It took me a long time to appreciate it. I was angry with my parents for many years because I, I felt like I was out there by myself. Um, and so I think I want Cindy to know that, yes, financially, I may have been more privileged than you, but I don't know that I ever got to not be black. Um, Living the life I have lived has caused me to be the woman that I am. I'm resilient, I'm strong, I'm capable, um, and you will find that with a lot of black people. We are resilient. Can you look at the things that we have lived through, our forefathers have lived through, survived through? Think about those who came across the ocean in a ship, the men in the bottom of a ship laid end to end and chained together. They were not able to get up and get out to be relieved of relieved. Um, so there was defecation on themselves. People died shackled next to each other. Um, and for however long the boat trip was, you were stuck. You could not move. Do you want to know why we hold on to the pain? That was bred into us. The pain has never gone away. We might not be shackled today, but shackles are put on people who are in jail, and you don't have a clue of how many people are jailed unjustly, jailed for things that white people don't get jailed for. They don't even get arrested for. They just get a slap on the wrist or a warning ticket. Being black has not been easy, but I'm so thankful that I am. I'm thankful that God made me this way. It wasn't a mistake that He made. He made people with different colored skin. He made people with different colored skin from the beginning. So I'm glad I'm who I am. I have been able to travel the world, even when it was lonely. I have had the opportunity to go to college on a scholarship, and when I ended my scholarship, I paid for school myself. Um, I it was a stretch sometimes for me and my family. I'm not going to say that I didn't have some favorable help along the way, and not from somebody black, from somebody white. And I appreciated it. But if you're white, haven't you had some favorable help from somebody white? Have you ever had some favorable help from somebody black? Or have black people always been bad to you? Think about it, because they haven't. I am sure that they haven't. I've been fortunate enough to work in a career that I loved, that I enjoyed. And yes, it was made possible because of the life that my parents lived and because of the connections that my mother and father had. But I worked hard. I worked harder, I would say, in many instances than the white people who were in the office. More was expected of me and more was given. I was often the only black person in my career in my office, and I had to hear snide remarks and comments, and sometimes you can't say anything because you've got bills to pay. You need your health insurance. And sometimes you've had all you can take and you just speak what has to be spoken. And you're looked at like, what made you think you needed to say anything in this conversation? But people make nasty comments. People have their opinions and they don't always keep them to themselves. And so sometimes you have to speak, or you will be so angry and so frustrated you can't do the things you have to do. White people don't understand, I think, in many cases, what white privilege is. And so I'm going to share with you from Peggy McIntosh, who was a professor. She created she created an article, or she wrote an article called "Unpacking the Knapsack of White Privilege." And I'm going to, it's a long list. There are 50 things on this list. I'm going to read the list to you, and at some point I'll try to scan the list in and post it on my Facebook page. So let's start. Number 1, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. 2, I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. 3, if I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. 4, I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. 5, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. 6, I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. 7, when I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. 8, I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. 9, if I want to, I can be pretty sure of finding a publisher for this piece on white privilege. 10, I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. 11, I can be casual about whether or not to listen to another person's voice in a group in which she or he is the only member of their race. 12, I can go into a music shop and count on finding the music of my race represented, into a supermarket and find the staple foods which fit with my cultural traditions, into a hairdresser's shop and find someone who can cut my hair. 13, whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial reliability. 14, I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them. 15, I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. 16, I can be pretty sure that my children's teachers and employers will tolerate them if they fit school and workplace norms. My chief worries about them do not concern others' attitudes towards their race. 17. I can talk with my mouth full and not have people put this down to my color. 18. I can swear or dress in secondhand clothes or not answer letters without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my race. 19. I can speak in public to a powerful male group without putting my race on trial. 20. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. 21. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. 22. I can remain oblivious of the language and customs of persons of color who constitute the world's majority without feeling in my culture any penalty for such oblivion. 23. I can criticize our government and talk about how much I fear its policies and behavior without being seen as a cultural outsider. 24. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk to the person in charge, I will be facing a person of my race. 25. If a traffic cop pulls me over or if the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. Excuse me. I can easily buy posters, postcards, picture books, greeting cards, dolls, toys, and children's magazines featuring people of my race. 27. I can go home from most meetings of organizations I belong to feeling somewhat tied in rather than isolated, out of place, outnumbered, unheard, held at a distance, or feared. 28. I can be pretty sure that an argument with a colleague of another race is more likely to jeopardize his or her chances for advancement than to jeopardize mine. 29. I can be pretty sure that if I argue for the promotion of a person of another race or a program centering on race, this is not likely to cost me heavily within my present setting, even if my colleagues disagree with me. 30. If I declare that there is a racial issue at hand, or there isn't a racial issue at hand, my race will lend me more credibility for either position than a person of color will have. 31. I can choose to ignore developments in minority writing and minority activist programs, or disparage them, or learn from them. But in any case, I can find ways to be more or less protected from negative consequences of any of these choices. 32. My culture gives me little fear about ignoring the perspectives and powers of people of other races. 33. I am not made acutely aware that my shape, bearing, or body odor will be taken as a reflection on my race. 34. I can worry about racism without being seen as self-interested or self-seeking. 35. I can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having my coworkers on the job suspect that I got it because of my race. 36. If my day, week, or year is going badly, I need not ask of each negative episode or situation whether it had racial overtones. 37. I can be pretty sure of finding people who would be willing to talk with me and advise me about my next steps professionally. 38. I can think over many options, social, political, imaginative, or professional, without asking whether a person of my race would be accepted or allowed to do what I want to do. 39. I can be late to a meeting without the lateness reflect on my race. 40. I can choose public accommodation without fearing that people of my race cannot get in or will be mistreated in the places I have chosen. 41. I can be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me. 42. I can arrange my activities so that I will never have to experience feelings of rejection owing to my race. 43. If I have low credibility as a leader, I can be sure that my race is not the problem. 44. I can easily find academic courses and institutions which give attention only to people of my race. 45. I can expect figurative language and imagery in all of the arts to testify to experiences of my race. 46. I can choose blemish cover or bandages in flesh color and have them more or less match my skin. 47. I can travel alone or with my spouse without expecting embarrassment or hostility in those who deal with us. 48. I have no difficulty finding neighborhoods where people approve of our household. 49. My children are given text and classes which implicitly support our kind of family unit and do not turn them against my choice of domestic partnership. 50. I will feel welcomed and normal in the usual walks of public life, institutional, and social. So I want to remind you that those 50 pieces of white privilege, the unpacking of the knapsack of white privilege, that was written in the 1960s. Today is 2020. All of those things still apply to white people today. That is what privilege is. That is what white privilege is. And because that white privilege has been built into every system in America from its inception, that is why we call it systemic racism. Think about it. Think about it long and hard. The systems have to be changed in order to make life fair and equal for black people. Mindsets of white people have to be changed in order for you not to see us as inferior. And the privilege that you enjoy doesn't necessarily have to be something that you think about. It just is. So that's the first part of my answer to Cindy Burbidge McNeil's long question. I'm still working on other answers because if you know me, I'm not just going to throw something out there. I'm going to have the facts to go with it. I thank you for listening. I'll be back probably tomorrow with some more information. And I'll continue to share my family heritage, my family story as we go along. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.